Some moments change the direction of an entire street in less than 60 seconds, and on a warm evening in Atlanta, that moment began with flashing blue lights reflecting off the hood of a quiet gray sedan parked along Maplewood Avenue, where Danielle Carter stood beside her car with her hands calmly visible, while two patrol officers watched her with the kind of suspicion that can turn an ordinary stop into something heavier. The air carried the distant hum of traffic and the soft buzz of streetlights coming alive as the sun dipped below the buildings, and for a few seconds, everything felt strangely ordinary. Officer Kyle Bennett adjusted his radio, while Officer Mark Hollis circled slowly near the rear of the vehicle studying Danielle, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense to him. She was calm, composed, and strangely unafraid, which only seemed to irritate them more. Imagine standing there in that moment, the smell of asphalt still warm from the day, the faint sound of someone's music drifting from a nearby apartment window, the quiet tension that builds when nobody on either side fully trusts the other. Bennett asked a few sharp questions about the vehicle, about where she was coming from, about why she seemed so relaxed, and Danielle answered each one, evenly, her voice steady, the way someone speaks when they know something the other person doesn't yet understand. A few people on the sidewalk had begun to slow down, watching from a distance, sensing the pressure in the air, because moments like that always feel different even before anything truly happens. Then something shifted, not a struggle, not chaos, just a sudden burst of confusion, a loud crack echoing down the block that sent a flock of pigeons exploding into the air and froze everyone in place. The street fell silent in the strange way it does when people are trying to process what they just heard. Bennett stepped back, breathing harder now. Hollis spoke rapidly into his radio, trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond the script they were used to following. Danielle remained on the pavement, conscious, but still incredibly calm, her eyes open, watching the sky above the power lines like she already knew what would come next. And then something small but important happened. Her phone, which had fallen only a few inches away from her hand, began to vibrate against the concrete once, then again, the screen glowing bright in the evening light. Hollis noticed it first and picked it up, expecting maybe a family member or a friend, but the name on the screen made him pause. U.S. Army Operations Command. He frowned, assuming it had to be some kind of mistake, and pressed answer. The voice on the other end spoke quietly, but with a tone that instantly drained the color from his face. This is Colonel David Harrington, with United States Army Command, who is currently in possession of Danielle Carter's phone. And in that exact second, every ounce of control the officers thought they had over that street began to slip away. Officer Mark Hollis held the phone a few inches away from his ear for a second, as if the voice coming through it had somehow changed the weight of the device in his hand. The streetlights above Maplewood Avenue hummed softly, while the flashing patrol lights painted the pavement in slow pulses of red and blue, and for the first time since the stop began, Hollis was no longer looking at Danielle Carter or at the small gathering of witnesses across the sidewalk. He was staring at the phone screen like it had suddenly become the most important object in the entire city. Colonel Harrington repeated his question with the same steady tone that carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately, who discharged a weapon. At that location, Hollis glanced toward Officer Kyle Bennett, who was still pacing near the patrol car, speaking into his shoulder radio, trying to sound calm, while requesting medical support and additional units, the kind of call officers make when they believe they still control the situation. But Hollis could feel something shifting beneath the surface, like the ground itself had moved a few inches and nobody else had noticed. Yet he cleared his throat and spoke carefully into the phone, identifying himself and the department. But before he could finish explaining, Colonel Harrington interrupted him again, his voice still controlled but sharper now. Listen carefully, officer. The woman beside you is under the protection of a federal program connected to United States Army operations. I need you to confirm her condition immediately, and I need you to remain exactly where you are due. You understand? For a moment, Hollis did not answer, because the words did not make sense in the world he believed he was standing in. A minute earlier, this had been a routine street stop on an ordinary block in Atlanta, with an ordinary civilian driver and two officers following procedure. Yet now a United States Army colonel was speaking directly into his ear, asking questions that sounded far above the level of a city patrol call. Bennett noticed the expression on his partner's face and walked closer, lowering his radio. What is going on? He asked quietly. Hollis slowly moved the phone away from his ear and whispered something that caused Bennett's confident posture to stiffen instantly. Both officers turned toward Danielle again, as if they were seeing her for the first time, not as a driver beside a gray sedan, but as a person connected to something far larger than the flashing lights surrounding them. Danielle remained calm, her breathing steady, her eyes open, watching the sky above the telephone wires where the first stars were beginning to appear, and the strange part was that she did not look surprised at all. It was almost as if she had expected the call to come. Eventually, Hollis lifted the phone back to his ear and spoke again, explaining that medical assistance was already on the way and that the scene was secure. But Colonel Harrington responded with a sentence that made the quiet street feel suddenly smaller. Good, because several vehicles are already en route to your location, officer, and when they arrive, the authority over that scene will no longer belong to the Atlanta Police Department. The words from Colonel David Harrington lingered in the air long after the call ended, and for several seconds Officer Mark Hollis simply stared at the silent phone in his hand, while the flashing lights from the patrol vehicle continued sweeping across the quiet brick buildings along Maplewood Avenue. The small crowd across the street had grown slightly larger now, neighbors stepping onto porches or pausing on evening walks, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, but none of them could yet understand how unusual it truly was. Officer Kyle Bennett stepped closer, lowering his voice, as if the entire block might somehow overhear what Hollis was about to say. What did he mean? The authority will not belong to us. Hollis did not answer right away, because he was still replaying the calm certainty in the colonel's voice, a tone that carried the weight of command, the kind of voice that did not ask questions unless the answers already mattered. Somewhere far above a city patrol officer's level, finally Hollis spoke, quietly explaining that the call had come directly from United States Army operations and that Danielle Carter was apparently connected to a federal protection program. Bennett blinked in disbelief, glancing toward Danielle again, as if expecting her to suddenly stand up and explain the entire situation herself. But Danielle remained still and composed, her eyes open, her breathing slow, the expression on her face calm in a way that seemed almost impossible considering the tension surrounding her. Imagine standing on that street at that moment, the smell of summer grass drifting from a nearby yard, the distant rumble of traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood, and the strange feeling that the evening had quietly shifted from routine into something that no police training manual had prepared anyone for. Bennett rubbed the back of his neck and looked down the road, as if he might see something approaching, but the street remained mostly empty except for a few parked cars and the soft glow of porch lights. Then Hollis's radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice confirming that emergency medical technicians were only a few minutes away and that additional patrol units were heading toward the scene. Bennett acknowledged the message automatically, yet his attention kept drifting back to Danielle, because the more he looked at her, the more a single thought began forming in the back of his mind. Who exactly was she, and why would the United States Army call within 60 seconds of a single incident on a quiet Atlanta street? Hollis placed the phone carefully on the hood of the patrol car, as if it had suddenly become evidence of something much larger than either officer could fully see yet, and across the street one of the bystanders whispered something while pointing down the road, because far in the distance a pair of headlights had appeared, moving steadily toward Maplewood Avenue. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, the way vehicles move when their drivers already know exactly where they are going. Bennett followed the direction of the pointing hand and felt a slow tightening in his chest as the headlights multiplied into several vehicles traveling together, dark shapes rolling silently through the intersection a block away. And in that quiet moment before they arrived, both officers realized the same thing at the same time. Whatever was about to step out of those vehicles was going to change everything they thought they understood about the woman lying calmly beneath the streetlights of Maplewood Avenue. The approaching headlights grew larger as the vehicles turned onto Maplewood Avenue, one after another, moving with calm precision that immediately felt different from the usual rush of city traffic. The engines were quiet, the pace controlled, and when the first dark sport utility vehicle rolled to a slow stop near the patrol car, the entire block seemed to hold its breath. Officer Kyle Bennett instinctively straightened his posture, while Officer Mark Hollis glanced toward his radio again, as if expecting the dispatcher to explain what was happening, but the radio remained silent. The only sound was the soft ticking of cooling engines and the distant hum of power lines above the street. One door opened, then another, and several men stepped out wearing clean dark uniforms without the flashing lights or raised voices that usually accompanied official arrivals. Their movements were measured, confident, the way people move when they already know exactly why they are there and what they are about to do. A tall man with gray at the edges of his hair stepped forward first, his presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. Colonel David Harrington had arrived, and even without announcing his rank, there was something in the way he walked that made the entire street feel smaller. Bennett and Hollis exchanged a quick look before Bennett stepped forward, beginning the familiar explanation officers give when another agency arrives on scene. But Harrington gently raised one hand, stopping the words before they fully formed. His eyes moved briefly across the street, taking in the bystanders, the patrol vehicle, the gray sedan, and finally Danielle Carter resting calmly beneath the glow of a nearby streetlight. The colonel spoke with the same composed voice that had traveled through the phone earlier. "Good evening, officers. I will need a quick update on her condition." Bennett hesitated only for a moment before explaining that medical support was already on the way and that Danielle was conscious and stable. Harrington nodded once, then stepped closer to where she lay, his expression changing slightly, not with alarm, but with a quiet focus, as if he were confirming something important. Danielle turned her head slightly toward him, her voice calm. "Despite everything, Colonel Harrington," he said gently, "we are here now." And that simple exchange carried a familiarity that neither Bennett nor Hollis had expected. Imagine standing there watching that moment unfold, realizing that the person you had believed to be an ordinary civilian had just spoken to a United States Army colonel, as if they had known each other for years. Behind Harrington, the other uniformed personnel moved with quiet efficiency, speaking into small radios and observing the surroundings, not interfering with the police officers, yet clearly establishing a presence that shifted the balance of authority on the street. Bennett felt a slow pressure building in his chest, the kind that comes when a situation begins revealing layers no one warned you about. Earlier in the evening, he had believed he understood exactly where he stood in the chain of command, but now that chain seemed to stretch far beyond the limits of city jurisdiction. Harrington turned back toward the two officers, his gaze steady, but not hostile, simply direct, as he asked the question that mattered most. "Officer, which one of you initiated the stop on Danielle Carter tonight?" And in that moment, both Bennett and Hollis understood that the quiet street where they had expected routine paperwork and a simple report had just become the center of something much larger than they could yet see. Officer Kyle Bennett felt the weight of Colonel David Harrington's question settle over the quiet street like a pressure that could not be ignored. For a moment, neither officer spoke, because answering meant accepting that the situation they had believed was routine had already moved far beyond their control. Finally, Bennett cleared his throat and stepped forward, explaining that he had initiated the stop after noticing Danielle Carter's gray sedan moving slowly through the neighborhood earlier in the evening. His voice tried to remain steady, but the confidence that had been there before was now thinner, as if every word might lead somewhere he could not predict. Harrington listened without interrupting, his expression calm, his hands folded loosely behind his back, while the soft glow of the patrol lights continued to wash across the pavement and nearby houses. When Bennett finished, the colonel nodded, once acknowledging the explanation, yet his attention returned almost immediately to Danielle Carter, as if she remained the most important part of the entire scene. Danielle watched him quietly, the same composed look still on her face, the look of someone who understood the situation far better than anyone else standing on that street. Imagine standing there as the tension slowly changes shape, no raised voices, no dramatic movements, just the quiet shift of authority that everyone can feel, but no one can yet explain. A distant siren could now be heard approaching somewhere several blocks away, likely the emergency medical team that had been requested earlier, but the vehicles that had arrived with Harrington had already begun organizing themselves in subtle ways, one soldier speaking quietly into a radio, another observing the surrounding houses and intersections, their presence calm, yet unmistakably official. Bennett noticed it immediately. These people were not acting like visitors, they were acting like professionals who had stepped into a situation they had expected long before they arrived. Harrington eventually turned back toward the two officers and spoke again, his voice measured but firm. "Officer Bennett, thank you for explaining. However, there is information regarding Miss Carter that you were not expected to know, and for the moment that information will remain limited to federal authority." Bennett felt the words settle in his mind like a locked door he was not allowed to open yet. Curiosity pushed him to ask the question that had been growing stronger with every passing minute. "Sir, with respect, who exactly is she?" Harrington looked at him for a long, quiet second, not with anger, not with judgment, but with the kind of calm patience that comes from years of command. Then he answered carefully, "Danielle Carter is a civilian specialist who has assisted United States Army operations for several years. Her work has taken her into situations where discretion and protection are extremely important." The colonel paused briefly, letting that information settle before continuing. "Tonight should have been an ordinary evening for her, and for everyone else standing here." Bennett glanced again toward Danielle, realizing that the woman he had stopped only 20 minutes earlier carried a role far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And as the approaching ambulance lights began reflecting faintly at the end of the street, he felt a slow realization forming in the back of his mind. This quiet block in Atlanta had just become part of a story that reached far beyond city limits, and the full truth about Danielle Carter had only just begun to surface. The distant siren grew louder as the ambulance turned onto Maplewood Avenue, its red and white lights reflecting across the dark windows of nearby houses, and for a moment the entire street looked like a quiet stage illuminated by moving colors. Officer Kyle Bennett stood beside the patrol car, watching the emergency vehicle approach while the words Colonel David Harrington had spoken continued echoing in his thoughts. "A civilian specialist assisting United States Army operations." The phrase sounded simple on the surface, yet the way Harrington had delivered it suggested layers of meaning that Bennett could not fully see. Yet Officer Mark Hollis felt the same tension building beside him, because every detail of the evening now felt different. The gray sedan parked near the curb, the calm expression on Danielle Carter's face, the silent professionalism of the soldiers who had stepped out of those dark vehicles earlier, none of it matched the ordinary street stop they had expected. When the patrol lights first flashed behind her car, the ambulance slowed to a stop near the curb, and two emergency medical technicians stepped out carrying equipment, moving quickly but carefully toward Danielle, while Harrington stepped aside to give them room, his eyes still watching the scene with quiet focus. Danielle greeted the technicians with the same steady voice she had used all evening, answering their questions calmly while they checked her condition. The exchange was professional and controlled, yet even they seemed aware that the environment around them was not typical. One technician glanced briefly toward the soldiers standing nearby, then back toward the patrol car, as if silently asking how a routine medical response had turned into something that looked closer to a federal operation. Imagine standing there on that quiet block, the warm evening air brushing through the trees, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the houses, and realizing that the story unfolding in front of you now carried consequences reaching far beyond the boundaries of that neighborhood. Colonel Harrington eventually walked back toward Officers Bennett and Hollis, his pace unhurried but deliberate, and when he stopped a few feet from them, the flashing patrol lights briefly illuminated the lines of experience on his face. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I want to make something clear. Danielle Carter's work has placed her in situations where discretion and timing matter more than most people understand. Tonight was not supposed to involve law enforcement attention, but circumstances sometimes move in unexpected ways." Bennett nodded, slowly absorbing the words, even though they only deepened the mystery surrounding the woman he had stopped earlier. "Sir," he asked carefully, "is she part of the military?" Harrington shook his head slightly. "Not exactly. She works alongside certain departments when her expertise becomes necessary, and that expertise has helped protect more people than most will ever realize." The colonel paused, letting the quiet weight of that statement settle, before continuing, "What matters now is ensuring that she receives proper care, and that we understand how tonight unfolded." Bennett looked once more toward Danielle as the medical team continued their work, and for the first time since the stop began, he realized something important. The calm confidence she carried was not the confidence of someone trying to avoid trouble. It was the confidence of someone who had already faced situations far more complicated than a flashing patrol light on a quiet street in Atlanta. And as the ambulance crew prepared their equipment, a new question began forming quietly in the minds of both officers. If Danielle Carter had been protecting something important, then what exactly had she been doing on Maplewood Avenue tonight? The quiet rhythm of Maplewood Avenue continued under the glow of the streetlights while the emergency medical technicians finished checking Danielle Carter's condition, their movements careful and professional, yet the atmosphere around them had clearly shifted from a routine call into something far more serious. Officer Kyle Bennett stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold, while a slow realization continued forming in his mind. Every answer they received about Danielle only seemed to open another question. Officer Mark Hollis leaned slightly against the patrol car beside him, his eyes following the small group of soldiers who had arrived earlier. They were not interfering with the medical team, yet their calm awareness of everything happening on the street made it clear they were not simply observers either. Imagine standing there feeling the quiet weight of uncertainty settle in, because sometimes the most powerful moments do not arrive with loud commands or flashing sirens. Sometimes they arrive with silence, with people who move carefully and speak even more carefully because every word carries consequences. Colonel David Harrington stepped closer to Danielle as the technicians finished their evaluation and spoke quietly with them for a moment before turning back toward the two officers, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I appreciate your cooperation tonight. Situations like this can become complicated quickly, but the most important thing is making sure that everyone understands the full context of what happened. Bennett nodded respectfully, although inside, he still felt the lingering confusion of someone trying to understand how a normal patrol stop had turned into a scene involving United States Army personnel. Sir, he replied carefully, we had no way of knowing any of this earlier. Harrington acknowledged the statement with a small nod, and his tone remained steady. That is correct, officer, and no one expected you to know Danielle Carter's work often requires that she appear to be just another citizen going about an ordinary day, which is exactly how it should be. The colonel paused briefly before continuing, but sometimes ordinary moments intersect with responsibilities that reach far beyond what most people see. Danielle listened quietly during the conversation, her gaze moving between the colonel and the two officers, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm confidence that had defined her presence since the beginning of the evening. It was supposed to be a quiet drive home, she said softly, nothing more. Bennett felt the honesty in her words, yet at the same time, he sensed there was far more behind them than she was saying, and perhaps far more than she was allowed to say. The ambulance crew prepared their stretcher nearby, ready to transport Danielle to a hospital for further evaluation, while one of the soldiers quietly relayed information through a small radio to someone outside the neighborhood. The soft murmur of that conversation carried just enough authority to remind everyone that this street was now connected to a larger network of people paying attention. Harrington then turned once more toward Bennett and Hollis, his eyes steady, as he spoke the next sentence slowly. Tonight will likely require a formal review, not because anyone here intended harm, but because when someone like Danielle Carter is involved, the situation becomes part of a much wider responsibility. The words settled over the quiet block, and Bennett suddenly understood something important. This was no longer just about what happened on Maplewood Avenue tonight. It was about understanding who Danielle Carter truly was, and why the work she did had quietly drawn the attention of people far beyond the boundaries of Atlanta. The evening air along Maplewood Avenue had grown cooler as more time passed, yet the quiet tension of the street had not faded. If anything, it had deepened into a strange calm, where every person present seemed aware that the night had already become something that would be remembered long after the flashing patrol lights were gone. Officer Kyle Bennett stood beside the patrol car, watching as the emergency medical technicians carefully prepared Danielle Carter for transport, their voices low and professional, while the soft metallic click of equipment echoed against the stillness of the neighborhood. Officer Mark Hollis remained close by, his attention shifting between the ambulance crew and the group of soldiers positioned near the dark sport utility vehicles, their calm posture unchanged, as if they had stepped into scenes like this many times before. Imagine standing on that quiet block, realizing that only 30 minutes earlier the evening had been ordinary neighbors walking their dogs, porch lights glowing softly, children laughing somewhere behind the houses, and now the entire street felt like a small point connected to a much larger world. Colonel David Harrington observed the scene for a moment longer before stepping closer to the two officers again, his expression thoughtful rather than severe. Gentlemen, he said quietly, there is something you should understand about Danielle Carter, and why this situation has drawn the attention it has tonight. Bennett listened carefully, sensing that the colonel was finally revealing the piece of the story that had remained hidden until now. Harrington spoke slowly, choosing each word with precision. Danielle Carter has spent several Years assisting specialized federal and military teams with analytical work that helps identify threats before they ever reach the public. Most people will never hear her name, and that is exactly how she prefers it, because the success of that work depends on remaining invisible to the world. Bennett felt a quiet shift in his understanding as the explanation unfolded. The calm confidence Danielle had shown all evening suddenly made more sense. She had not been calm because she felt safe. She had been calm because she had spent years navigating situations where pressure and uncertainty were simply part of the job. Hollis glanced toward Danielle as the medical team finished securing their equipment and helped her prepare to move toward the ambulance. She looked tired now, but still composed, and when her eyes briefly met the officers again, there was no anger, there only a quiet acknowledgement that the night had unfolded in ways none of them had planned. Harrington continued, speaking, his voice steady. The work she contributes to has prevented serious threats from reaching American communities, including cities not far from this one, which means that even though most people will never know her role, the impact of her efforts has already protected thousands of lives. The colonel paused, letting the significance of that statement settle into the quiet street. Bennett slowly exhaled, realizing that the person he had stopped earlier that evening had been someone whose influence stretched far beyond the simple image of a driver on a neighborhood road. The ambulance doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and the technicians prepared to depart, while one of the soldiers quietly confirmed details through a radio nearby. And in that moment, Bennett understood something that no report would fully capture. Sometimes the people who quietly help protect a nation are the same people who appear completely ordinary until one unexpected moment reveals the truth about who they really are and why their presence matters far more than anyone could have imagined. When the patrol lights first appeared behind a gray sedan on Maplewood Avenue, the ambulance doors closed gently with a soft metallic sound, and the quiet street of Maplewood Avenue seemed to pause for a moment, as if the entire neighborhood understood that the evening had crossed an invisible line between an ordinary patrol stop and a story that would quietly travel far beyond that block. Danielle Carter rested calmly inside the vehicle, speaking briefly with the medical technician beside her while the soft glow of the interior lights reflected against the glass outside. Colonel David Harrington stood near the curb, watching the ambulance prepare to depart, his posture steady and composed the way a person stands when the situation has finally returned to a level of control. Officer Kyle Bennett and Officer Mark Hollis remained beside their patrol car, neither speaking for several seconds, because sometimes silence is the only way the mind can process the weight of everything that has just happened. Imagine standing there under the soft buzz of a streetlight, realizing that less than an hour earlier the night had seemed completely routine, a quiet neighborhood patrol, a simple traffic stop, a few questions and paperwork. Yet now the same street carried the quiet presence of federal personnel, military vehicles, and the knowledge that the woman they had encountered was someone whose work had quietly protected communities far beyond Atlanta. Harrington eventually turned toward the two officers, his voice calm but thoughtful as he spoke. Gentlemen, tonight will be reviewed carefully, not as a punishment, but as part of the responsibility that comes when different parts of our system intersect unexpectedly. Bennett nodded, slowly understanding the meaning behind the colonel's words. There would be reports, conversations, and official evaluations, but none of those things would change the most important lesson the evening had already delivered. Sometimes the people who appear most ordinary are the ones carrying responsibilities the world never sees. Hollis glanced once more toward the ambulance as the engine started and the vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, its lights no longer flashing urgently, but moving steadily down the quiet road. One of the soldiers closed the door of a dark sport utility vehicle, while another spoke briefly into a radio, confirming that the transport was underway within moments. The small convoy that had arrived earlier began to move as well, their vehicles turning calmly toward the main road, leaving behind only the fading sound of engines and the dim reflections of patrol lights on the pavement. Maplewood Avenue gradually returned to the peaceful neighborhood it had been before the stop. Neighbors slowly stepped back inside their homes, porch lights flickered softly, and the distant sound of evening traffic returned like a reminder that the city was continuing as it always did. Bennett looked down the empty street for a moment longer, then quietly removed his patrol cap, running a hand through his hair as he reflected on the night. He had worn the badge for years, believing he understood the world that unfolded on the streets of his city, but tonight had revealed something deeper. Authority is not always visible, power is not always loud, and sometimes the people who help protect a nation are the same people you might pass on an ordinary street without ever realizing who they truly are. As the patrol lights finally dimmed and the night settled back into silence, one quiet truth remained hanging in the warm Atlanta air: the badge may carry authority on the street, but respect for the unseen work of others is what truly protects the people who live there.